Okay. All right, so hopefully that's going. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this virtual reading by Katy Carl. I'm Taryn Okuma, and on behalf of the English department at the Catholic University of America, I want to welcome you to this event, which is co-hosted by Vermilion, Catholic University's new student-run magazine of literature and the arts. Now, before we get started, I want to give you a sense of what you can expect during this hour. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Katy, and then I'm going to invite her to say a few words about her remarkable debut novel, As Earth Without Water, before she reads an excerpt for us. Following the reading, she's going to answer questions asked by some of the readers who are joining us on the call. So I'm very grateful to Katy for joining us tonight. Katy Carl is the author of As Earth Without Water, published by Wise Blood Books. She's also the author of Praying the Great O Antiphons, My Soul Magnifies the Lord, which is forthcoming from Catholic True Society later this year. She is editor-in-chief of Dappled Things magazine, a senior affiliate fellow of Penn's Program for Research on Religion and Urban Civil Society. And Katy is also currently pursuing her MFA in creative writing at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. In 2020, she was selected as the inaugural Wise Blood Books Writer in Residence. I have long been an admirer of Katy's writing across genres, and I'm honored to have her here with us to discuss this novel, which so beautifully and so intensely probes the nature of the artistic life, of trauma, redemption, faith, and love. Katy, welcome.
Taryn, thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm really grateful to be here. It's really a fulfillment of a long-held desire to be creating this kind of work and to be able to communicate with a wider audience. So thank you so much. The novel I'm going to read from, As Earth Without Water, is my debut. It's the first full-length piece of fiction that I've published, and the story follows two young artists through their early development, getting established in the world, and then the consequences and complications when one of them decides to leave it for a monastery. So the chapter I'm going to read is the second chapter, and it follows the conversation when the two rivals and former lovers have not seen each other for many years. I'll just go ahead and get started. November 2015. Behind the monastery guest house at night, beyond the flagstone path that borders the back garden, the novice monk crouches near the cypress hedge. I sit still, lower, grateful for the shadow. We're side by side, unevenly supported on a low, ragged rock wall that separates incense-scented evergreens from an empty flower bed that he says, in the spring, will hold daylilies. Our hip bones, our hands, are chilled by the stone. Nervously, the novice's fingers flick and flick, a familiar gesture, dismissing imaginary ashes. He would be smoking now, if cigarettes could be had here, if the smoke would not betray his location. It is late autumn in Kentucky, and leaf fires have been springing up all day, like golden crocus in yards and gardens, but the residual smoke would not mask the smell of tobacco if it could be had. Under my hand in my coat pocket rests the last of a pack, with matchbook tucked inside. Would it be a sin to offer him a light? We've been talking for more than half an hour now, and although I've listened with all patience to phrases like the discernment of the spirits, following the path of prayer, that he evidently feels explain everything, I'm no closer to understanding what he wants to say than when I found the note he left atop the guest room desk. The frosts have barely started, but the novice monk is shivering. Around us, the scent of hay and wet leaves rises from the fields. I always knew I couldn't get safely through the world alone, but I never realized before coming here that I didn't need a family so much as I needed a community, he is saying, not for the first time. They've been amazing through all of this. It'd be terrible to leave now. I don't know what I'd do without them. You said you're not supposed to know I'm here. How did you find out? Guest house check-in list on a clipboard. It's always left sitting around by the community message board where we get our tour assignments, like to check who's come here. I take an interest. Like I said, secrets don't keep in the cloister. You didn't tell anyone about meeting me either? I told the prior and my director I was writing to you at your place in Chicago to invite you for a visit. I've been forthright, as far as that goes. Admittedly, it might not go far enough. But this isn't usual. I describe an arc like a bower over us, my index finger painting the air, taking in him in his habit and black fleece jacket, me in my jeans and aubergine pea coat, the cypresses, the wall, the cold night. Yeah, no, but I'm meant to be on retreat now. To meet with you in the normal way this week, I would have had to ask permission, and I doubt I would have been given it. So our timing didn't really work out. That's my fault. I forgot to put all that in my letter, but I'm glad you're here. I needed to talk to you. Why do you need to be here? Why not go somewhere where your past won't matter? Somewhere you won't be judged? He hesitates before he answers. The past always matters. The past leaves marks. I'm more than the choices I made, but those choices are part of me now. Wherever I go, they'll follow me until I face what they've made of me. What I've done to others, to you, yeah, but not only to you. If I don't face that here, I'll have to do it somewhere else. And so I may as well try to stay in the place I've come to love. I may as well choose where I stand. But you've already chosen. Why this doubt now? Sure, you made mistakes when you were young. I don't even think you need to call them all mistakes. They're just called youth. Was I a mistake? Don't answer that. I laugh a little too brightly. He smiles, but then he smudges his hand across his face. Still, even so, what about forgiveness? Don't you believe in that now? I am forgiven for all of it. That's not the point. His voice has come out too high at first, like a young teenager's. When he speaks, he does not meet my eyes, does not look away from his hands. So finely articulated at the joints and tendons, elegant, capable, these fingers have stopped their unconscious dance and now lie on his knees, simply shaking, cold or unsteady, or both. I want to take them in mine, to warm them. I lean over, as if to reach for them, but he's holding himself so strangely still and so far from me that I fear the ways the gesture could go wayward, and so I stop. I'm forgiven, he goes on. It's not a question of that. He's not boasting. He lays claim to mercy as a flat, even regretful statement of fact. Is my doubt showing on my face? He looks as if he wishes he did not have to say any of this. It's a question of trust, trustworthiness. Another whole person could fit on the wall between us. I lay my hands as flat as I can on the gritty stones, one on each side of me, feeling the need of solidity. Do you trust the people in charge here? I ask him. More than I trust myself, he admits. But if you can't trust yourself, who can you trust? The opposite's the case. It's only been too easy for me to trust almost anyone. A better question, one I'm learning to ask, is whether anyone else should trust me. Never have I seen him in any such state. His shoulders slope downward, his profile angles away, toward the rim of the tree-clouded Appalachian Valley, in which his monastery now looms darkly. Our Lady of the Pines. The guest house is founded on a slope that rises slightly above it. From the garden, the path to the main house descends. He cannot lift his eyes to meet mine. A strange anger rises into my throat. What are you telling me? Are you saying that you think, or are you saying the community here thinks that you shouldn't stay? Won't you have even more trouble if you leave? I am trouble, you should know. His tone, for all its play, carries an edge. Sorry, devil's advocate. Be my advocate instead. He tries to smile, but his lips quarrel with another impulse. Help me understand then. You said you were so happy here. You said you never wanted to leave. What went wrong? My head aches, my eyes blur, my hands numb themselves against the stone. I tuck them into my pockets again, feel the pack, the matchbook. Only one? No, it would be unkind. I'll do my best, he says. I don't fully understand it all myself, but I know I would have even more questions if I were you. What should I be asking you that I'm not? Like a sick man flushed with a jolt of health, he manages to lift his face now, but not toward me. He squints against the wind that scours the stars in a purplish sea of air. Turning toward me, he still avoids my eyes, fixing his instead on the gray horizon, where light pollution from Louisville pours over the pines. Over us, the waning moon has risen, gibbous. Its glow on the flat drape of the novice's habit obscures his form. His features in the eerie light are closed off, scrubbed of expression. I try again. Let's go back to how you first came here. From what I heard, you ghosted everyone, even Beatrice. After I left New York to start fresh in Chicago, Beatrice used to forward me the email newsletter she wrote and circulated for him. For me, above the header line, she would add wry little personal updates full of dishiness, the official version omitted. I caught more of her than of him in these, and small wonder. But early in 2011, not long after the new year, those notes had stopped coming. The last one had ended. Who the hell knows when I'll send you another one of these? You never respond anyway. So I surmised I had only stopped hearing about Dylan because I had offended Beatrice with my silence. To have found out instead that the letters had halted because the Dylan I had known was gone, was calling himself Thomas Augustine, had thrown away everything that in his place I would have fought so hard to have kept, but not before becoming engaged to his publicist and then just as quickly breaking it off. It was wrong of us, of me, not to tell you, he says, but you were so far away from it all. We really thought you had found your own way, that you might not even care. I felt that if I reached out, I'd be dragging you back into what? He doesn't pursue this line of thought past the trailhead at which it begins. Anyway, after Beatrice announced it, I had asked her to keep it private a while, and she'd put a notice in the Times. I couldn't. Already the next day, I knew I couldn't live that way anymore. I had been knowing. The announcement pushed me into taking steps. I didn't come here right away at first, but it was the beginning. Okay. And you never saw fit to, okay. Beatrice must have lost her mind to have asked him. Think of the life they would have had. More questions, unaskable, irksome, float to my lips, must be submerged. Could you have been faithful to her as you never were to me? Would you have even tried? Beatrice would eventually have minded his many other lovers. She wouldn't have let him make a fool of her as I had. I could never have gotten married and stayed married. And I wasn't wrong to be chasing after that. It isn't what I'm meant for in this world, he offers, as if this is any help. So let me make sure I understand. You broke the engagement, why did you let things go that far if that was how you felt about it? You told your friends in the city goodbye, the woman you loved? And you must have burned a lot of bridges too. All the best bridges, you have to admit. However good for art, a quiet life might be. But but why a monastery? You weren't even Catholic then. Why not just some cabin in the mountains? Why not your old place in Florence? And why alone? It is all coming out wrong, out of order. And you didn't say anything about it until now, until you wrote me that, what do you call that? What kind of letter was that after 5 years? Really, I'm sorry. There was no excuse for how I left things with you or with her. The next thing he has to say comes out only after some labor. He presses his hands flat together, one to the other, the fingertips lined up and angled toward the ground, keeping, between them, some invisible remnant of feeling under control. If I could have ever gotten married and stayed married, I think now, he says, it would have been to you. I have to laugh. Are you kidding me? We wouldn't have survived it. We're both such insufferable people. Not to each other, we aren't. There's some truth to this. I have to collect my thoughts, reorganize them. He goes on. Beatrice and I wouldn't have stayed together. I know that now. She was using me for status and image just as much as I was using her. She's easy to pity, given sufficient distance. No, it wasn't her fault. She'd been trained her whole life to think that way. She wasn't upset for herself when I left to come here, or so she said. But she told me I was letting down the cause of art and disappointing everyone we knew, and I thought, good. But once I knew what I had to do, once I knew I had to come here, I was afraid I'd lose my courage if I didn't do it right away. How did you know? What do you mean had to? I know this must feel abrupt. I'm glad you were able to make the trip. Abrupt isn't what I'd call waiting 5 years to tell me what was going on. I've missed you. What has life been like for you since I saw you in Chicago? He doesn't merely miss me. I sense some deeper reason for his behaving like this, calling me out here into the cold. Not much different until last week. I was let go from Griffalux. Oh, no, I'm so sorry. But why? No good reason. The stupid economy. Even this late, at night, in the year, in the history of the earth, a grasshopper perches on the wall. Between us, its filigree wings pulse against its small body. Its chitinous legs scrabble. It hops in an ellipse atop the granite, like a person looking for a lost possession. You'll land on your feet, he says, and I hope this weekend gives you time to recharge. I'm glad you're here, really glad. It's good to see your face, hear your voice. But really, why did you ask me here? You said you wanted me to talk to your prior before you took your vows. What is it I'm supposed to say for you that you can't say for yourself? About us back when? Or all that was so long ago. How does it matter now? Are you thinking of leaving to marry Beatrice after all? I had hoped this last would make him laugh, but now, as it leaves my mouth, I can hear that it will not land. It is no joke to him. His face in the moonlight is set like statues. You don't take this seriously, he says. No, I do, I say, standing up. I need to go in now. No, he says. And I can see his younger hand grasp for mine, clasp it, but now? No, he sits unmoving. There's a thickness in the air, a ghostly density that repels touch. Whatever influence Dylan, no, Thomas Augustine, can have, it will have to come through his voice. He says, stay, please. What time is it even? I feel dizzyingly drowsy. Check my phone, 1:05 a.m. I need to go to sleep. Just, if I could finish saying it, why am I here? Please, 30 minutes. I need to tell you what happened. I flick the black screen, watch the numerals spin upward. There, I'm setting a timer. When this rings, I'm going inside the guest house and I'm going to sleep. Let's hope no one trips over us before that. The groundskeeper doesn't make a patrol. This isn't a prison. No, I know where the prison is. I point to my forehead, then to his. He flinches, as if I've slapped him. All that is left of his hair is a strip about an inch wide circling his skull. The crown has been shaved off entirely. I soften my voice. Sorry, you said I should meet you here. You said you needed to talk to someone who might understand. Okay, whether or not I can understand, I'll try to. I'm here now. I'm listening. As at last he begins to speak, my defenses fall, fade, dissolve into numb disbelief. The numbers on the timer spin their way towards zero, measuring our wasted time. I feel as if I've been sitting across from him, trying to understand how he sees the world for as long as we have known each other, yet what he has just told me defies understanding. When the phone alarm chimes, I cut it off, reset it, and keep listening. It is nearly 3 in the morning when silence finally falls. At 3:10, the chime rings again. I show him the clock on the screen and say, you have just enough time to sneak back. Don't get caught. Not me. I'm invincible now. He laughs. The grasshopper leaps off the stone wall. The ghost that has lingered between us now floats up and hovers, follows him down into the shadow of the valley.
Thank you, Katy. We have some questions now from some of our participants. Julia?
Embodiment is one of the major themes of the novel. At one point, Thomas Augustine says, it happened in my body. And he envisions the trauma of the assault residing in his body. There's references to the suffering that his mother's body undergoes giving birth to him, and the way that he uses Angel's body to advance his own career. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what the novel is saying about the body and the human person?
Yes, I will flag that that's a difficult first question, but I also love it. Both Tolstoy and O'Connor talk about the ways in which a work of fiction is always the only thing that a novelist can really fruitfully say about the thing they're trying to address. But I'll do my best. So the um, the experience of human embodiment, whether we're looking at it from a standpoint of individual experience or as a study in fiction or in art, we're also looking at the themes of the body soul duality, the kinds of integrities and the felt divisions that can arise here, right? Um, I think we're also necessarily looking at the icon of personhood, which can be an experience that orients us toward the divine, or that if it's abused, can drastically damage and distort other people's lives as well as our own. And I think both of those dynamics play out in the events of this novel, and in the relationships between characters. This question of reverence toward an icon versus false worship of an idol is also something of a longstanding preoccupation with me. And I think that the way the characters relate to their own and each other's bodies, and also to imagery, right, to the imagination, it is it speaks toward that. As an undergraduate, I studied not only fiction and creative writing, but also philosophy with a focus on Thomistic and personalist thinkers. So my approach to building characters is really deeply formed by those personalist thinkers, in particular John Paul II, which is fitting because today is his feast day. And Love and Responsibility is the work that I didn't realize until I was preparing to answer this question was deeply underlying a lot of my perception of their relationships. Right? These questions that he addresses deeply in the book of sensory impression versus ontology of the person, the emotional and sensual attraction that people experience toward each other versus the mature experience of willing the good of the other, right? And their utility as, useful for pleasure or for profit or for what have you, versus the genuine acceptance of the other that is involved in self-gift, right? So John Paul II talks in Love and Responsibility about what he calls sort of double egoism in relationships where both characters are seeking themselves rather than seeking the good of the other or a common good that might be shared between them. René Girard also talks in Deceit, Desire in the novel about this dynamic in surprisingly similar language. I think a project for a scholar, which I'm not really a scholar, a cool project would be reading Deceit, Desire in the novel in relationship with Love and Responsibility, and seeing the relation between those two descriptions. Girard calls it double mediation, where they're both desiring something that they think the other has more so than they do. They're desiring each other, but what they're really desiring is this good that they think the other has, and they're going to obtain it by possession of the other. But of course, that's not really possible, and so it ends up in what Girard calls deviated transcendence. And again, the John Paul II talks about these ways in which we can falsely conflate in relationships the sensual and the emotional with the spiritual, or and we can sort of make gods out of each other rather than turning our interior life and our worship toward the God who's the only possible source of the satisfaction of this kind of desire, right? So that these kinds of competing notions of self-gift and freedom certainly live at the center of this text, as well as how those relate to the unchosen or given character of our bodies and of experience, which I think a lot of folks who write, at least on the popular level, about those experiences, maybe there can be a kind of, and I'm going to walk very carefully here because I'm not an expert in these texts, but I think we're all influenced by them, right? There can be a sort of sense that this is always going to be like a joyous and positive and easy thing because it's quote unquote natural. And I think a lot of us maybe experience that the natural isn't so natural, or that it doesn't come easily, right? It doesn't make itself easily felt or found, right? It takes some finding. So the sorts of complications that these characters experience, in part because you know they they're errors about how to treat each other, from ranging from the commonplace and easily forgiven all the way to the grievously traumatic, tend to block their progress. So I hope that that answers your question. Okay.
Jessica?
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much for that reading. I'm looking forward to reading the book. I do know that you did the Wise Blood Books Writers in Residence program with Dr. Joshua Wren. So I would just love to hear more about that experience, how it helped you in writing the book, what changes the book went through, in this whole process, and maybe key takeaways or lessons learned about your writing in doing this.
Sure, thank you. And I'm so glad you could make it. The novel was written in, I guess, two major pushes. A first draft from 2007 to 2010, and then a second one from 2015-ish to 2018. But then at the end of that process, I didn't really have one cohesive novel. I had two sorts of novellas about the same characters, but that didn't really track to each other or mesh with each other. And so a lot of the work of revision involved bringing these two stories into relationship and into tandem with one another. And that's the draft that I finally shared for the Wise Blood residency. The way that came about, I guess I can say a little bit about it. It was just that I had sent a scene from one of the later chapters to Joshua in 2017, and he remembered it enough to ask me when he got a grant for the Wise Blood residency to see if I wanted to apply to finish this work and get it across the finish line, which I did. Obviously, the rest is history, but I really can't overstate the influence that the residency had on my final vision of the novel. It still wasn't very integrated when Joshua saw the first draft, and the heart of the ceremony, as George Saunders would put it, was missing. And not only because I wasn't clear yet, and I'll say a little bit about this later, I wasn't clear yet on how Dylan's assault had come about. All of the details around that were very fuzzy. I just knew that he had been traumatized in some way, and that he wasn't very willing to communicate about it. Dylan was not, as a character, easy to work with in ways that I'll also talk about later. But I did come to love Dylan as a character very much over the course of the writing too. But Joshua is just a brilliant editor, as well as being a spectacularly gifted fiction writer himself. We share many of the same thematic and technical preoccupations. So our conversation really clarified, informed, and strengthened my intentions for this book. We obsessed over individual word choices to a degree that a lot of people might find exhausting, but I found exhilarating. And although I missed out because of COVID on the travel portion of the residency, we still found a way for me to make time within the context of a crazy life with young children at home to get this work done. And I think that was one of the ultimate providential gifts of the way that it all unfolded, because I would not have thought that would have been possible if we hadn't had to do things the way that we did. It is genuinely a gift. I'll always be a little bit sad that I didn't get to travel for it, but we were able to get the work done, and my gratitude's always going to be just beyond expression for that.
Lindsay.
Hi, Katy. It's nice to see you again, and thank you for giving us this delightful evening and wonderful book. So I have two questions. The first is, did you always intend to tell two conversion stories, or did it happen organically through the writing process? And I think you were sort of just gesturing at that. And then in what ways did the various sexual assault scandals of the church that were in the news in the last few years affect the way that you thought about the novel, and particularly the subplot of Dylan's assault? So I was just thinking specifically of the McCarrick scandal, and did that influence, the way that you told the story, or just, I don't know, the way that you thought about his character? Did it help clarify how you wanted to, write about his assault and everyone's response to it? So.
Sure, those are great questions. Thank you. To address the first one, yes. From the outset, I knew that I would be addressing at least one religious conversion. I didn't know I would be addressing two. That happened organically. I didn't know whose was going to be, it was going to be in the forefront, and it turned out that both of them were significant. The question of the scandal is a little more complicated. So I knew from the beginning of I guess the first draft, that some active abuse was going to be, central to what happened to Dylan, right? I discarded a lot of ineffective early plot versions that would have had Dylan under suspicion of being a false accuser or of initiating an assault himself. In the process of revision, I realized that those stories were coming about in his own mind as a character, it precisely simply because he felt this terrible survivor's guilt and shame and unresolved pain, and all of that was causing him to over-identify with his own abuser. Which, when I read sources about psychological trauma, that kind of checks out as a thing that can happen. He himself, I think at first couldn't believe that a priest would even be capable of something like this, that, he was essentially, beginning to find real freedom, as John Paul II talks about in this Catholic sexual ethic. He was trying to instantiate that and embody that, and instead of help, he found the absolute opposite. He found something so destructive. So through the plot and through their interactions, the characters seemed, the good characters, I would say, seemed to be asking themselves and each other, how do you continue to believe in a God of love? Not necessarily when he quote unquote allows those things to happen, because we know that the root of evil is not in God, but in the malice of the human will. But like, even looking at that malice, like, how can that be possible? And in a good humanity, right? And how do you persist in a faith and in a belief when people who are claiming to represent that belief with their words are actively contradicting it with their freely chosen behaviors? And I mean, that is a deep mystery, and that's something I definitely don't approach lightly, but Dylan's character demanded it, and I think that it was right, and it was at least in part, it was by the end of the first draft, the 2015 to 2018, that those questions were starting to come to the front of revision and composition, and to just not go away and really demand to be addressed. So yeah, and it's obviously tied up with the question of continuing belief, for sure.
Mary Smith.
Thank you so much, Katy. I'm hoping that you can discuss the atmosphere that you were trying to create for the reader by using non-linear memories to tell your story.
It's a great question. Thank you. So in his famous preface to Portrait of a Lady, Henry James talks about how fiction has to be based on a sense of felt life, but he says really precious little about how you're going to achieve that sense of felt life on the page. And every writer who spent more than about 5 minutes trying to embody a character or make a scene lively knows that your own feeling of the scene or your feeling of the character is not going to be nearly enough. You also have to be able to make the reader feel that felt life. And so So at first you can use sensory detail to enchant the human attention, but by itself, that's not going to be enough to carry a novel-length narrative forward. So unless there's some deeper human concern at stake, we're going to we're going to encounter an enchanting series of sensory descriptions, and we're going to put the novel to the side, or we're going to fall asleep in the middle of it because it's going to get boring. So the challenge is really to do what O'Connor called deepening mystery, and one way you can set yourself up to succeed at that, and God knows I can't judge my own work, but one way you can at least try is to revisit a particular scene again and again, increasing the reader's desire to know what's going on in that scene, what's going to be revealed in that scene. The repeated recurrence to Dylan's confession scene in the garden then is meant to heighten curiosity about what happened to him. Yes, sure. But by itself, I think even that attempt would be maybe could even be exploitative of both the reader and the character if it's not approached with reverence. So the deeper reason that I structured things this way is so that each time you receive more of the information about what happened to Dylan, you're receiving it in a context of his whole personhood, and not just like, so it's not reducing him to just what happened to him. Like, so he's just not simply or merely a survivor. He's not defined by this, a well-known, unfortunately well-known narrative, right? But he's defined by who he is, and where he comes from, and what kind of person he is in his soul. So for good and bad, because as we all are, deeply imperfect. But it makes it, I hope, so that you can receive a deeper sense of character, of identity, and especially a sense of how much it means to him to have this kind of place of peace and stability, and why the fact that that's denied him and the way in which it's denied him becomes harder and harder to look away from, which again also mirrors the process for me of coming to this story itself and trying to do justice to it. A model that I took for this kind of construction was Ford Maddox Ford's The Good Soldier, although I think that novel's trajectory is very, very different, because mine is, I hope, ordered toward like a restoration and a healing of memory. Ford's is, taking you deeper and deeper into the depravity of this set of characters, right? But he uses the nonlinear narration to do that. He uses that narration to bring you down and down, spiraling with these characters into a profound perceptual shift of who they are and what their actions mean to themselves and to each other. So nonlinear narration, I guess, to answer your question, can get you to that kind of perceptible shift and correction of vision, which I hope, again, it is, at least that's an effect that I was striving for. So.
And then we're going to go back to Julia, who has some questions.
So these are on behalf of Jennifer Rulo and Heather Wright. Which character proved the most difficult to write about or write from the perspective of? And can you tell us about the process of developing that character? What experiences or influences did you draw upon to create them?
Sure.
Oh, you're muted now, Katy, sorry.
Forgive me, sorry. Yeah, I found Beatrice surprisingly tricky. Part of her deal is that she embodies this particular kind of aesthetic, aristocratic New York life that a lot of us are taught from a really early age that we're supposed to desire and envy and pursue. And that perception can be really hard to shake as a temptation. So I read a lot of fiction and nonfiction to try to arrive at a sense that I was getting her right, that I was making her as human as she could be and not just a caricature of that kind of mediated desire. The books 7 Days in the Art World by Sarah Thornton and The Art of Rivalry by Sebastian Smee were particularly helpful with her milieu. So were contemporary New York novels like Min Jin Lee's Free Food for Millionaires. Of course, Christopher Bay's indispensable Arts and Entertainments and Index of Self-Destructive Acts. And also I interviewed folks who lived in New York City themselves and could tell me a little bit more about what a normal person's life there might be like, for contrast, which was helpful. Dylan was difficult in different ways, more because entering into his story was emotionally difficult naturally, but my terror of misrepresenting his experience then I guess was less mimetic and more driven by that sense of tragedy, right? So I read from various psychological sources about trauma to make sense of his experience, as I mentioned earlier, but I still associate the most with him the book Thomas Merton's 7-Story Mountain, right? That aspiration upward toward something higher. And I don't think that that's, interestingly, and I wonder if I wonder if readers will agree, but I don't think that he loses that sense of aspiration at the end either. I think he's in a place where it's going to be more difficult to recapture it, but not impossible. And I don't think of his story as ultimately necessarily tragic, although it does to some extent evoke pity and fear, which Aristotle says tragedy has to do for us. It's inconclusive, the note that his character resolves on, but that inconclusion is deliberate. It's meant to signal hope. Does that answer it?
I think so.
Thank you. Yeah. We have another question from Mary Smith. Oh, you're still muted, Mary.
Sorry about that. Towards the end of the novel, Angela anticipates this conversation and imagines this conversation with Dylan, who we realize, throughout the whole novel, she knows him so well. But this imagined conversation is really off the mark from what what the conversation ends up being. So can you elaborate a bit on what that experience would have done to her sense of events and their meaning, that it was this different person maybe in front of her?
Sure, I think that's a good reading. That's what I intended really was to have her understand in that moment, even more so than she does in the conversation that takes place in the monastery around Elaine's departure. Elaine's fun. We should talk about Elaine. But the sense that she's not really seeing him as he is, and if that's always been her wound with regard to her relationship with him, she's been doing, in a certain sense, the same thing. She's never really been seeing who's really there within her interactions with him, but instead what she wants and what she wants to gain for herself, right? If she's been careful to guard the center of her being from exposure, right, she realizes in that moment that he's always had to take the same care with her and for the same reasons. So I mean, it should be it was a bit heartbreaking to realize there was still that amount of distance after all this between them, but I think necessary, and of course always better to have the truth than to have a comforting lie, right? The right, and the seeds of this sort of destructiveness and decay in relationships, right? That's what sin does to our relationships, right? But it also relates back to this question of cyclical or nonlinear time in the novel, where a foregoing event can shape our understanding of an event, of one that comes later. So yeah.
Okay, and then I have a question to read that was submitted by Jennifer. What authors most influenced your work and have shaped your identity as a writer?
So everyone's going to be shocked in this room if the first name out of my mouth isn't Flannery O'Connor. But there are ways too that I've been coming to more and more recently, in which O'Connor's grotesque realism of large and startling figures is kind of a borrowed garment that doesn't really fit any of us quite right. It was tailored just for her by herself. And those of us who also have to deal with being Southern Catholic women writers and yet also needing to hear our own voices the way that God put them into our mouths and not hers, are going to to grapple with this, I think, and particularly. I'm not alone in that, but I think because her powerful sense of her own identity as a Southern Catholic woman writer has had so much to do with shaping the sheer possibility of me finding mine. Harold Bloom says that most writers are strong misreaders of the authors who influence them most. So if I don't produce a strong misreading of O'Connor, I'm unlikely ever to produce much of anything else. And of course, as a writer with roots in the South too, you can't put a single word on the page without Faulkner and Warren breathing down your neck. The green light in Dylan's eyes also shows that I'm distinctly Fitzgerald haunted. But at the same time, it's become necessary to me to start thinking about Christian realisms, plural. O'Connor talks about a Christian realism, and I think that there almost has to be more than one Christian realism because hers can't be the only one that we have access to. A thinker called Carl Muth, and I'm totally borrowing right now from literary scholar Helena Tomko, who I just heard give an amazing talk on Sigurd Undset. She was said by this literary scholar, Sigurd Undset was said by this literary scholar Carl Muth to be practicing what he called an integral realism, meaning more than just naturalism, but a realism that integrated the natural and the supernatural, seeing them as not existing apart from each other, or not seeing the supernatural as fictional, but or as completely constructed by human society or human culture, but as necessarily part of human reality and human experience. In a similar way to nature, but not, but as supernature, right, in the full meaning of that word. Also, the American realism of Henry James, who, like Dylan and Angela, had to grapple with the influence of the old world classical culture that also, to some extent, fit him like a borrowed garment. And then finally, the contemplative realism that's articulated by Joshua Wren, who I know is out there somewhere listening, in an essay that's coming out through the Benedict XVI Institute, and I want to say February of next year, if my notes are right. Okay, so finally, though, when we're talking about this book in particular, I'm in really deep debt to Christopher Behe's What Happened to Sophie Wilder, which is one of the first novels in the past decade to show that a contemporary novel of serious faith was still possible. Thanks in part to him, we have a lot more novels like that now, but in 2014, it landed like a revelation. I picked it up and I was just stunned that this, could be possible in the contemporary milieu and in a contemporary idiom. And if it didn't exist, I don't know if I would have had the courage to carry through this initial vision to its logical conclusion.
All right, and I think we have time for one last question. I'm actually reading a question that was submitted by Lindsay Weldon. The way that both Dylan and Angela reflect on themselves as they see others sin, Dylan with his rapist and Angela with Dylan's mother, caused me to reflect on ways my own sinfulness is similar to each of the characters. Did you intend for the book to lead readers to something like an examination of conscience, or what are some of your hopes for its readers?
That's a really great question. And my hope, I don't know that I intended anything like an examination of conscience, although it's kind of funny that we were just discussing this exact function that fiction can have in class yesterday evening at the USC MFA in the Art and Metaphysics of Fiction class, talking about the way in which seeing characters struggle and fall and stumble and destroy themselves on the page can be tragically cathartic for us and cause us to reflect on, just like in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Utterson, the lawyer, is reflecting on his own past. Before even any of the really serious stuff in the novel starts to go down, he's already reflecting on his own past and wondering, what secret sins are in my background that could, bring me down the way that this Hyde has clearly come down in the world, right? Or Jekyll has clearly come down in the world, right, before he knows that he's Hyde too. It's so I don't know that this sort of harrowing experience is anything that I intended. Rather that I hoped that the novel would conduce to healing, really for folks. It's difficult to say exactly how that dynamic can play out, but I've definitely experienced fiction that can be a conduit for healing, and not in a sweetness and light sort of way, but in a facing, countenancing reality as it is, and learning to make peace. Not with intolerable realities, certainly, because I think part of the way that we do come to healing is to name what was done that was wrong, and to recognize it as evil, not to pass over it, not to say, fine, this was fine, it was okay that this happened. It's not okay, it wasn't okay, it's never going to have been okay. But at the same time, the person to whom it happened can still be okay. And I think that is a difficult reality, but something that is very necessary. And I think, one of the ways that it plays out, the healing of relationships as well as a theme in the novel. That I can see that Colin has his hand up, and I'd like to try to squeeze in a question if we can.
Oh, thanks. It's terrific. I was just sort of, when I read it, I was curious, just I guess how this particular story came about, because to me it was so unexpected in its sensitivity and its I think its accuracy. I was alarmingly, I felt seen almost, that Dylan is so relatable, because I'm a monastic dropout with trauma and who paints, and but I guess it's because the story you would expect is either the trauma happened before and that fuels his art, and then he goes to the monastery and it, like, you have a cathartic moment and then everything's cool, or you have the trauma and then you like lose your faith and become this a raging atheist or something, and neither of those things happen. Something to me real and yet completely unexpected from what stories usually are comes about. And how did that happen?
Thank you. That's actually really, I'm really glad that the novel resonated in this way, right? I guess, how did it come about? It really was a slow process. I mentioned before, when I talked about revision, that the draft, the early draft, really just followed their early development and trajectory in their relationship. The problem with that early draft was that it didn't go anywhere. I saw characters, but I didn't see action. A lot of it was just getting characters down on the page and making them believable. It's solidifying details about their backstories, their pasts, their families, their physical appearance, their inclinations, predilections. Associating particular types or styles of art or philosophies of art with particular characters. And getting those pictures clear in my head. And then I wasn't sure what to do with it. In fact, when I put it away pretty conclusively for the first time was when Dylan decided to leave for the monastery, and I wrote scene after scene after scene after scene of him explaining this decision, explaining, and I thought, finally, well, why does it matter? It's the action that matters, right? He doesn't have to justify himself or stand up for this or that a particular excuse for it to someone who's not coming at it from the same perspective that he is. Just let him do it and see what unfolds. And then I realized again that that he would have this type of encounter at having an abusive situation arise. And again, I cycled through all kinds of possibilities for that. And in the end, again, just realized that too many of them were playing into typical or too well understood narratives. And I think part of what happens when you have this kind of commonly understood narrative is that the people disappear. And above all, I didn't want the people to disappear. So that was, I guess, the driving motivation, was that these characters would still be clearly seen, right? and that hopefully there could be some kind of peace, some kind of resolution, some kind of healing, even if not an easy one.
Thank you. I feel like I wish we could ask you a lot more questions, but we won't keep you. We're out of time. I really want to thank you, Katy. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the gift of such a thought-provoking and beautiful novel. I also want to thank Mary Smith for managing all the technical details for the event, as well as assisting with the planning along with Julia Harrell and Lindsay Weldon. And I also want to thank Vermilion for co-sponsoring, and thank all of you at home for joining us via Zoom and YouTube. I wish we could all gather in person, but it's amazing that we get to talk with Katy, who's in Texas right now, and we are all where we are. So thank you all so much.
Thank God for modern technology. And for all of you, thank you, Terrence, so much.